and so many new faces as well. It's great. Tonight we've got Andrew Copson from the British Humanist Association. He's one of the main people actually in our movement. And it is, for me in particular, a joy and a huge delight to be able to welcome him here tonight. Rather than go on and on introducing him, I've given you one of these things, okay? Which tells you all about him, but not everything, not quite everything. It looks like it might be. Tonight's meeting is going to be chaired by Tony. Be gentle with him because he's prone to tears and temper. So, serious. Well, I'm sure he will do a good job. So on that alone, I would just say...
I should start straight away.
Welcome.
Are you going to say anything, or should I just start talking now?
Well, I'll just say Dennis has done a very good introduction to our illustrious speaker. I hope you all treat Andrew gently, and
there's no need.
I'll let Andrew begin to speak. And
I think I'm going to stand up because it feels better, but it does feel very high. Do I look too high? No. Okay, I'm getting away with it so far, and that's fine. Okay. I've been asked to speak about new threats to secular education. Well, the first thing that I want to say about this title is that education, state-provided school education in England and Wales, has of course never actually been secular. It's not been secular since the first day that it was instituted in the late 19th century, and it's not been secular since it was secondary education was made universal in 1944. In three particular ways, our school system, our state compulsory school system, has had strong religious elements in it. Ever since 1944, when secondary education was made universal, there's been compulsorily on the statute book a daily act of collective Christian worship in every school. Ever since 1944, when the 1944 Education Act made secondary education universal and compulsory, there have been schools, about a third of those state-funded secondary schools, that have had the power to religiously select their pupils. And ever since 1944, there has been some element within the compulsory curriculum, and we'll talk about more of the details of this later on, but at least some element in the compulsory school curriculum that has to do with, once upon a time, religious instruction, nowadays religious education, apart from in some faith schools where it's still religious instruction. And that's the third and principal non-secular element to our state education system. So in talking about threats to secular education and new threats to secular education in England and Wales, I want to just point out right at the very beginning that actually we've never had secular education, at least in our state-funded school system. I'm going to follow these three strands of non-secular religious elements in our state education system through the 20th century. Those three strands of worship, of religious admissions, and of the curriculum through the 20th century. We'll start with worship. Now, in 1944, when the Daily Act of Collective Worship was put into our schools, and that was the first time that it had been made compulsory by law, so such state schools as did exist previously may have had some sort of opportunities for Christian worship. They mainly did, but it wasn't compulsory. Ever since 1944, we have had it compulsory, as I said. The motivation for putting it into the Education Act is not quite clear. Some people say it was an act of piety at the end of a long and difficult war, a sort of national thanksgiving, rewarding God by putting him onto the face of the bill and then into the Act, the Education Act. Some people think it was, and this is the most likely explanation I think, some people think it was part of the deal that Rav Butler, who was the Education Secretary at the time, did with the various churches in order to get the state education system up and running, because that required churches to put their schools into the system, as we'll discuss in a moment. Some people think it was a sort of preemptive blow against the fear of godless communism, which would become so prominent a feature of the late 40s and 50s in England, not so much as in America, but certainly still in England, some sort of mechanism to ensure that whatever happened in this crazy new idea of universal education at a secondary level, still there was some sort of guarantee of Christian civilization at the heart of it. But whatever the reason might have been for this going into law, there it was, there it still is. And in spite of the various attempts for the last 40 or 50 years to amend it out, to get rid of that provision in the law, every time there's an education bill, the BHA and the Parliamentary Humanist group have a go, put an amendment down, have a debate. It never has succeeded so far, but nonetheless we do. In spite of all that, that provision still is there in our education law. One of the things that's happened to it through the 20th century is that it is more honoured in the breach than the observance. We know from Ofsted reports, until Ofsted stopped inspecting it about 5 or 6 years ago, because they just decided it was too ridiculous to inspect it anymore, and sent out quite a strong signal by stopping inspecting it. But when they were still inspecting it, we know that about 80% of secondary schools, according to the last Ofsted report that looked at it, were not following the law. That sounds quite cheering, but we don't quite know in what respect they weren't following the law. It could be that it wasn't daily, or it could be that it wasn't religious, or it could be that it was religious but it wasn't Christian, and the school hadn't got special permission not to have Christian worship. And the more worrying news is that the last time Ofsted inspected it, 96% of primary schools were upholding the law. So even though most secondary schools weren't, most primary schools were. Well, in spite of all that, the law on collective worship remains, and today is still there to be used and resurrected by religious lobby groups, as we'll come to when we discuss the new threats in a moment. So that's worship. That's what happened to the law on worship, required in all our state schools through the 20th century. We'll come on to religious admissions. In the 1944 Education Act, what was effectively created was a universal statewide England and Wales system of education. And in order to be able to afford to create this system, the government of the day, the coalition government of the day, not always a good idea, coalition government, the coalition government of the day relied on being able to bring religious schools, existing religious schools, into a state system. Otherwise, essentially, they couldn't guarantee a place for every child because they couldn't afford it. So special arrangements were reached with the Roman Catholic Church and with the Church of England to bring their existing schools that had developed, in the case of the Roman Catholics since the 19th century, in the case of the Church of England since the 18th century, bring those schools into the state system. And in return for being part of that state system, they were given certain powers. They were given powers to teach denominationally, which we'll come to when we talk about curriculum, but they were given powers to show preference for the children of certain parents in the admissions to their school. So where you had schools that historically had been founded in order, so let's take Catholic or Jewish schools, for example, historically been founded in order to give education in the religion of the parents to the children, those schools were allowed to continue to give preference to parents of their religion in their own admissions. And all the Roman Catholic schools took up that power when they came into the state system, and all the Jewish schools took up that power. And about half of the Church of England schools did, and half of the Church of England schools didn't. And there's a distinction between those two which is of almost no interest, and we won't explore, but at least half of them did. That's the important thing for the moment. Another thing that they were obliged to do, being part of the state system, was to pay 50% of the running costs for the school. And in that way, it was held to be a sort of deal between government on the one hand and religious organisations on the other, a sort of 50-50 fair funding deal that sort of mitigated the apparent unfairness of having selective admissions that prioritised the children of some parents over the children of other parents within the local area. As the 20th century moves on, what happens is that the percentage, without any public scrutiny almost, without any public awareness, and the percentage of money contributed by the church body, whatever it might be, reduces, and the percentage of money contributed by the state, by all of us, increases. So about 20 years after the Education Act 1944, the proportion has gone to 60-40, about 10 years later it's gone to 70-30, about 10 years after that it's gone to 80-20, and today we're in the position where 100% of all the costs of these religious schools are met by the state, but they still have the power to give preference in certain circumstances to children who are parents of particular religion. So that's the story of religious selection in the state system throughout the 20th century. Add that to the continued existence of the law on worship, and we'll come to the third area in which the state education system is non-secular, and what's happened to that in the last sort of 60 years, 60, 70 years through the 20th century. In the 1944 Education Act, the same act we've been talking about since the beginning, provision was made for all schools to teach a syllabus of religious instruction. Now, in particularly religious schools, Church of England schools, Roman Catholic schools, or Jewish schools, that religious instruction was allowed to be according to the religion of the school. So the governors of the school would set a syllabus in accordance with which the children in the school would be instructed into Roman Catholicism, or Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, or Anglicanism, or whatever. In all other schools, state schools that weren't under the aegis of some sort of religious body, a syllabus of religious instruction, which would be Christian but non-denominational, was to be taught to all children and to be drawn up by local committees. So there are local committees or local authorities who would draw up a syllabus, Bible studies and stories about Jesus and learn the Ten Commandments and so on and so forth. And that would be taught by law to all children as religious instruction. And the aim was pretty clearly thought to be the inculcation, the nurturing of a child in the Christian religion, generically, whatever that might be. This is probably the area of religiosity within our school system that changes the most through the 20th century. Pretty much as soon as the Act is passed, it's very heavily contested. There are lots of people disagreeing with the nature of what's being taught in religious instruction. Lots of non-conformist free church people saying this isn't the sort of Christianity that we recognise at all. In the 50s and 60s, you get immigration from obviously people with non-Christian religions, but also from people with a very different sort of Christianity who don't recognise their own religion in the syllabus of their children's school. You get the whole rise and increase in Britain and Europe and around the world of people with non-religious beliefs, and by the early 1970s, by 1974, you get the first local syllabus of what by this time is widely called religious education, to include non-religious beliefs. The Birmingham syllabus of 1974 for religious education includes humanism and Marxism and existentialism and various folk religions of Africa as part of its syllabus. There's a brief attempt in 1988 by the Conservative government to sort of turn back the clock. An education bill is amended in the House of Lords that tries to sort of reassert and re-Christianise this approach. But between then and now, effectively what happens is that in non-church schools, and by church I include by what this time are also some Muslim schools, more Jewish schools, one or two Sikh and Hindu schools, in non-church sponsored schools, the sort of thing that is done in religious education is broadly recognised to be education about different religious and sometimes non-religious ways of looking at the world. Not any sort of religious instruction, not any sort of religious nurture, and that's sort of the position that we're in now, or have been in until very recently, until these new threats that I'll talk about. Of course, while that's the situation in the schools, the state-funded schools that are not controlled by a religious organisation, in those schools that are still controlled by religious organisations, the syllabus is still controlled as it was from 1944 onwards by the denominational governing body of the school that prescribes the syllabus in accordance with one religion or another. So, there we are at the cusp of the 20th and 21st centuries as we move towards today. We have these three religious elements still fairly deeply rooted within our state system. A law on worship, which still exists, even if it's slightly more on in the preach and the observance. Religious admissions, which originally were a deal between the churches and the state because the churches were putting in money, the churches stopped putting in the money, but they're still getting the power to control admissions. And we have a syllabus of religious education, which is what was once called religious instruction, which in community, non-religious state schools has gradually broadened and become more academic, but in religious schools is still permitted to be by law and often is instructive, inculcating a certain religion rather than educating about the different religions and beliefs that do exist in the world. In the last 12 years, that picture, which remained pretty uniform for 60 years before, has radically changed. Between 1944 and, let's say, 2001, there was a clear trajectory emerging. Observance of the law on worship was declining. Teachers were calling for it to be repealed. Religious groups were calling for it to be repealed. Even in Church of England state-funded schools, it became a dead letter. In terms of school admissions, the law was being tightened. Religious schools within the state system could only discriminate in certain situations. Eventually the case became by sort of mid-2005-2006, they could only discriminate when they were oversubscribed, and gradually religious admissions are disappearing from the scene. In terms of the syllabus, in Church of England schools, which remains the largest single category of religious schools in the state system, the syllabus was becoming more and more indistinguishable from the sort of thing that was taught in community schools. There's a secularising tendency. If you look at the 70s and 80s and 90s, it appears that what will eventually happen is that these remaining religious schools in the state system, almost all of them Church of England, are going to just become the same as community schools, perhaps with a slightly more extravagant nativity play, at Christmas perhaps with some more ostensibly Jesus-y posters on the walls, but in their ethos and in their curriculum and in the sort of teachers they employ, generally they're tending in the direction that society is tending in, which is towards the less religious and the non-religious. So where then come the new threats? Well, one of the factors, I think, which underpins the new threats to secular education is that decline in religiosity. Religious belief, religious practice, religious self-identity are all in what seems to be terminal decline in England and Wales currently. So between 1950s and today, we've gone from having something like 80 or 90% of people saying that they are Christian to having something like 47% of people saying they are Christian. I'm not referring to the census, which is a nonsense question that produces crappy data. I'm referring to surveys like the British Social Attitudes Survey that's really quite robust. So the 40% swing in self-definition, cultural self-definition in England and Wales from Christian towards non-religious. And that's really the least impressive shift that's happened. Going from 80% to 47% in terms of identity is nothing when you look at what's happened to religious practice, where religious practice has sunk really to be the concern of a tiny minority of people in England and Wales. About 6% of people go to a place of worship on a weekly basis. Right? So 94% of people do not go to a place of worship on a weekly basis. And of course the bottom has fallen out of belief as well, though that's more difficult to measure, so we won't get into any details of it. Now, while that's been happening to Christianity, while that decline in religiosity has been happening to Christianity, other religions that are more recent occurrence in the British social landscape are also feeling the squeeze. People from, say, let's say second or third generations of people whose grandparents came from elsewhere, for example, many people who came with Muslim beliefs to Britain, are having their own religious traditions squeezed by modernity, squeezed by the fact of being in Britain. And there is often perceived to be, and this was certainly true of the people who set up the first state-funded Muslim schools in England and Wales, there was often perceived to be a sort of a squeeze on traditional values that needs to be countered. And in fact, there is a decline in religious practice amongst Muslims in Britain, though from a much higher starting point, as it were, over the last 4 or 5 years. So this is the first factor that creates one of the new threats to secular education, this decline of religiosity. Because what do religious leaders and religious hierarchies and religious organisations do when they're beginning to hemorrhage support but have still got huge money and power and significance as institutions? They look for ways to try and shore up a weak position. And in 2002, the Church of England produced a report on the future of its state-funded schools, which was basically all about that. It was written by a man called Lord Deering, who'd written previous educational reports in his career, and he recommended hundreds of new state-funded Church of England schools to be opened over the coming years. And in a miraculous display of telepathy, the Labour government at the time was able to press release welcoming the report within minutes of its publication. Definitely they hadn't been tipped off, and they said they hadn't been in questions in Parliament, so they wouldn't lie. And they were able to welcome it wholeheartedly and say, absolutely yes, this is what we want. We welcome the Church of England. Church of England schools are terribly successful, really well loved by parents, very good discipline, very good ethos. We want hundreds more of them, yes please. Just last year, the Church of England produced a successor to this report, where they were even more explicit, and the sentences follow on from each other simply like this. They say, there is no one going to church. One of the few places that we have anyone's attention now is in our schools. We should do more with it, and we should have more schools. Pretty unashamed, the motivations. The subtext is becoming text very rapidly in the Church of England's own official publications about this. And when you think about people like Cat Stevens, this singer and songwriter who became Yusuf Islam and helped to fund the first state-funded Muslim schools in England and Wales, the motivations, the explicit motivations, are pretty much the same. So there's a crisis in our religious beliefs being squeezed. There isn't enough active transmission of these beliefs. They need to be sustained. A way to do that is through schools, and we can have schools within the state system, so let's have them. So in a perverse way, the decline of religious belief in a country where religious structures and institutions, and especially the Church of England, which is established and has all the influence that brings with it, the decline of religious belief in such a context is actually a great threat to secular education, because it motivates and mobilises religious institutions to use the power they have to attempt to take, as it were, more ground within the education system, and they have been successful in doing so. But that's just the first threat. The second two causes have to do with why, when religious groups put themselves forward in this way, the government should be so quick to say, yes please. Because on the face of it, religious schools don't save the government any money. They're 100% funded, just like community schools are. They don't seem to have any obvious merit to them. They run sometimes quite counter to what successive governments in the 21st century have had as their agenda of community cohesion or social cohesion. So it's not immediately obvious why government should rush to embrace this offer from the Church of England and other religious groups to play more of a part in our state education system. One of the reasons, and one of the threats therefore, has to do with something that is in itself quite a good thing, but has a rather negative effect in this context. And that is the general idea that there should be equality in our society, that there should be somehow equal treatment of people regardless of their different characteristics. This is obviously something that first came in to our law with race, and then with sex, and then with disability, and now since European directives and our own domestic government passing things like the Equality Act, has been extended to the equality ground of religion or belief. Now, in a context where the spirit of equality says you should treat people equally, you have to start looking at what some people have that other people don't have. Now, the spirit of equality is not so much of a problem in France, in our context, where no religious groups have state schools. They have some state-funded schools, because although the government of France is explicitly secular, it does actually give quite a few subventions to Catholic schools, but they don't talk about that, and we don't really want to talk about it here either, because it's not very interesting. Apart from to point out the hypocrisy of French secularism, but for another day. When you get distracted by French secularism, it's difficult to pick up your train of thought. Oh yes. This spirit of equality is not so much a problem in a country like France, where the equal treatment you're talking about is the equal treatment, the equal right to have nothing of any state fundedness at all. But it's a real problem in England, where if you're wanting to treat different religious groups equally, and one of the problems about this approach is that it talks about groups rather than individuals, but that's something for a debate on equality law rather than education. But if you want to treat religious groups equally, then the bar is set at a very high level, because we have an established church. We have one religious group that is incredibly privileged in our country. And so in order to treat religious groups equally, you've got to really level up. And this argument was made all the time, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, by the government of the day, and in a sense it was difficult to resist it, saying, well, we have church and women's schools, a third of our state education system is Christian schools, which are state-funded. It is impossible to deny, if they can meet the same requirements that those schools meet in terms of curriculum and regulation, it's impossible to deny that same right to other groups of religious parents and religious people. Why shouldn't they have state-funded schools? They are taxpayers, they are citizens. They should have, the Muslim parent should have the right that her Christian neighbour has within our state-funded education system. Now, of course, the right answer is that you should abolish all state-funded Christian schools, and that all schools should be secular. But in a situation where that's not amenable to government, you can see why government would say, yes, in the name of equality, we would create new religious schools. And that's why equality in this context is a threat to secular education. The other reason, the third threat, and the other reason why government would say, yes, please, is because not just this government, but the last government as well, had a general preference for public service reform. And that big phrase covers a lot of different initiatives and activities. But it generally seems to mean public service abolition, sort of, not in that these services cease to be available to people, but they cease to be provided by the state. So it's sort of, under the Labour government and the current government, it generally, public service reform has tended to refer to a process whereby, although public services are still state-funded, they are decreasingly state-provided. And that's been the case in social care, it's been the case in all sorts of welfare provision, and it is the case in education, both increasingly, but always has been. So if you're a government that says, okay, I want to do public service reform, and I want to really have civil society, people out there, community organisations, voluntary organisations, self-constituted civil society, delivering public services because they can do it more efficiently and responsibly and better than the faceless, unbending, bureaucratic state can do, and remember on a sanction basis, then on an independent, non-regulated, unregulatable basis. But that argument completely disappears under a deregulated academy and free school system. So, under that deregulation, system of deregulation, under that public service reform regime, we've seen an increasing land grab by religious organisations. The Church of England, which in 2002 wanted its 200 extra schools, has now come back in last year with saying it wants another 200. It's also said it wants to be a reliable partner to non-religious academies and free schools, to be have a sort of paternalistic relationship as the only alternative to local authorities with any experience of running schools. Free schools can adopt a religious ethos without being designated as a religious school. So a secular community academy or free school can adopt a religious ethos by virtue of just hooking up with a religious group in a way that was very heavily regulated ever since the 1944 Act, as we've seen. Of the 33 new religious free schools set to open in 2013, we've also seen the first state-funded religious special schools and alternative provision schools. We've seen the first schools of really quite small denominations, like Greek Orthodox, or a school that we're not even quite sure what it is. It's a sort of it describes itself as a multi-faith school that seems to promote the idea of religion generally as being a good thing, whatever religion it is, and that's its religious character. You can see the appeal, and you can see how this is enabled by the fact that whereas you used to have to put up at least a little bit of money for your capital costs if you were a religious group wanting to open a state school, under the academy and free school system 100% of your costs are met. And because of and encouraged by the deregulation of the curriculum, we've seen increasing setups of new schools from groups that just want to teach nonsense, groups that have a pseudo-scientific agenda, free schools that have creationist beliefs, even though they say they won't teach creationism, have been authorised for opening. And so unregulated is the process of new schools opening. The Department for Education didn't even know that these organisations were creationist organisations. And we sat in a meeting with the civil servants at the DFE, pointing out the creation policies on these schools' websites, and the civil servants had never seen them, claimed never to have. The government had never taken them into account in the decisions it was making. Are we finished?
No, if you want to...
you gave us a little sigh.
Made it sound I was probably sighing.
I was meant to come to an
As somebody who's worked in education, probably sighing about the awful things you're describing. No, you don't have to finish. No, carry on as you wish.
I've only got 5 more minutes. Don't sigh.
No, if you want to carry on the next 15...
It is terribly sad, this story. A little sigh is fair enough. And why does all this matter? I will draw to a close. Why does all this matter, everything that I've said, or the new sort of regime of deregulation, public service reform, and the decline of religiosity, making religious groups more aggressive? Well, it really does interfere and prevent the one-day implementation of an education system that we would like to see, of an education system that does educate children of different backgrounds and different beliefs together, not separate them up and segregate them, especially in an increasingly diverse society, in a way that the current trajectory now has it. A system that will teach about the different religions and beliefs that do exist in society, and lay in front of children and young people not only the full heritage of humanity, but the different ways of living that currently are about in our world, and not narrow the horizons of children and impoverish their education. I mean, one of the saddest things I saw actually ever when I went into any sort of religious school was when I went into a Muslim primary school in London, and there was a religious education class. Because it's called the same thing, religious education, even though it's quite different. And we were in there for about 10 minutes, during which the children were asked about 9 questions about various events, happenings in this set of stories. And the question was the same every time. It was, how do you know that, what's the story about blah, 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 and then one child put their hand up say here's it was the boys' class reading, because there's gender segregation. So there's the boys' class, the boy would say, oh, this is the story where Muhammad did X or Muhammad did Y. And then the teacher would ask, and how do we know that it happened that way? And all the children's hands would go up in that way that young children do when they're really desperate to be asked because they know the answer. It was unsurprising they knew the answer, because the answer was always the same, which was because it's in the Quran. So again and again this question was asked, how do we know this is true? And the answer was always about because it's in the Quran. And how do we know this is true? And the answer came because it's in the Quran. And it was really sad to see sort of, intellectual horizons being narrowed and options being closed down in front of your eyes. And that is what our state education system allows, and allows in greater numbers in all sorts of schools now. So there's not only the problem of segregation, the problem of lack of mutual understanding, which is so necessary in a more interconnected society, interconnected world. There's also the problem of indoctrination, even if it's only indoctrination by omission of other options, and in some cases actually indoctrination of a far worse variety than that. Well, what are we doing about it? A wide range of different activities that the BHA and our supporters in Parliament and elsewhere have. It is one of the aspects of the new sort of very decentralised, in some ways, education system that we have, is that you have to work really hard, and it's very resource intensive, to try and stop new religious schools when they're setting up around the country. So one of the things we've been doing recently is working a lot more with local grassroots campaigns, and we've had 3 or 4 successes in that way, 1 or 2 great terrible defeats, but that's one of the things we're increasingly doing with local campaigns, because when you ask local people if they want new schools that, by the way, their children aren't allowed to go to, surprise, surprise, they often say no. They would rather have a community school that their children could go to. We continue to lobby on the national level, and we've had some successes in that as well. We had a campaign with government about having creationism and the teaching of pseudoscience banned in new free schools, and government did vary the free school funding agreement, the academy funding agreement, to change the provisions there to try and outlaw creationism. Also nationally, we've had some successes in preventing, this is a really technical and nerdy bit of education, well actually it takes too long to explain. We had another success which is very important. Okay, so I will explain it very quickly. Okay, so it used to be the case that if you wanted to convert from a community school to a religious academy, you had to do it in 2 stages. So you were a community school, and then you converted to an academy, and then the academy had to convert to a religious academy. And there was a proposal to make it a 1-step process, so that a community school could convert into a religious academy in 1 step. And we stopped that. Yeah, there you go. It doesn't sound like a big thing, but take it from me, that's a very big thing. So there's that, and all sorts of national policy initiatives that we've had have got sort of smaller and more particular, and as a consequence they're a little bit difficult to beat the drum about, but they are very important, even though they're extremely specific and niche, and we do carry on with that work even though it is a very unsympathetic government in lots of ways. We also continue with our parliamentary work, but again there have been very few pieces of legislation to actually seek to amend that have implemented this new school regime. Very often it's been done either as a matter of policy or as a matter of secondary regulation, which has been very difficult, therefore, to seek to change through our supporters in Parliament in anything like a transparent way. And we also work, as well as locally and nationally on the political side, also increasingly taking strategic litigation to try and prevent some of the worst excesses of the Free Schools and Academy programme. We had a bit of a knockback last week when we had a judicial review against new Catholic schools in Richmond, but we've had quite a good success when we had the Information Commissioner force the government to release all the details of new sponsors, which is our way of trying to flush out some of the more extreme and ridiculous religious sponsors for new schools before they get too far in the application process. What can you do? Well, we are in desperate need always of information on the ground. I mean, things being what they are, there being no sort of central list of proposed schools locally, we're very dependent on people on the ground in particular areas feeding information into us about what's happening, where and when. And of course, we're a membership organisation, always in desperate need of funds as well as volunteers on the ground, so you can join us to show your support too. Oh, a prop. A handy prop. There's a leaflet. Shall I share this leaflet? This is a beautiful green leaflet. There you go. There are some at the back then. If we'd have been asked 15 years ago whether the general trajectory of education in a secular sense was going in the right direction or the wrong direction, I think you may well have said it was going in the right direction. As I said at the beginning, a general secularising tendency in society at large was manifesting itself also in even the largest category of state-funded religious schools, the Church of England schools. And some laws, like the law on worship, have become effective dead letters. I think if you ask the same question now, then you'd have to say that we were going probably in a very negative direction for secular schools. We have the largest number of state-funded religious schools that we've ever had. We also have the largest proportion that we've ever had of our state system being constituted of religious schools. Although the proportion even declined slightly in the 80s and early 90s, it's been going up since 2002. And all the signs are that this government, and probably future governments, will not want to reverse that trend of bringing state provision out of public services. And the moment that you open the possibility for voluntary groups to run public services, including schools, some of the first groups in there are religious groups, quite understandably. They want to survive. They have a particular agenda. They also have a long involvement in education that gives them a superficial plausibility and appeal. I think it's only through hard work and trying to stem the tide as much as possible in the hope that some future government will eventually, in the face of demographic change, see the pointlessness of attempting to secure dying institutions against their inevitable fate, that will ever really have any successes. So I encourage you to be cheerful, with an eye to the long-term future. Give us all the information you can about what's happening in your area. Join the BHA and ask me any questions that you... Well, I have one here already. But ask me any questions that you would like. And maybe I could have a glass of water or something, because I'm almost finished this.
Nice, thank you very much.